Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
We've reached the end of May, and unfortunately, we're still plugging away at planting, but hopefully we're going to see that wrap up over the next week or two, and we can turn our attention to the rest of the season. We've got Aaron Wilson joining us today to give us a look back at what we've seen this spring and also a sneak peek of what's to come. Welcome, Aaron.
Hi, Elizabeth. Good to be back.
It's always great to have you on, and we know that weather is one of our favorite topics. So let's dive right in. Give us a recap of what we saw this past spring.
This spring has been pretty interesting, a little bit of everything. Certainly, if we look back at our forecast, we expected the spring to be wetter than average. And while we started out a little bit on the wet side late in the winter season, it really hasn't transpired from an amounts perspective. And I'll kind of dive into that just a little bit. But if we look back over the last, 3 months here, March was pretty warm. It was our 21st warmest March on record going back to 1895. And it happened to also be our 47th driest. And so, it was kind of promising. We expected a lot wetter conditions in March, but that really didn't materialize as much as we thought it would. And as we were heading into April, obviously with some early season warmth again and dry conditions, that helped us dry out from those late winter heavy rainfall events that we saw. Then we got to April, and we went from 21st warmest in March to our 51st coolest April on record. So it was pretty cold across the region, averaging about 2 to 5 degrees below average across the state. And again, this may be surprising to folks, but April was our 42nd driest April on record. And so I say it may be a surprise to folks because we had numerous days of precipitation. We had a lot of light precipitation events. There were some locations across Ohio that saw 22 days of precipitation during the month of April, but still came in about 50% of normal in terms of total amounts. And so that set up a situation where we had a lot of cool, cloudy conditions for much of the April month. And there's been some regional analyses around the Eastern Corn Belt region, Illinois, for instance, that the total amount of solar radiation was down for the month of April. We just had thick clouds. There wasn't as much solar radiation reaching the surface. And with frequent rainfall, even though it was lighter rainfall, it kept soils damp. And soil temperatures don't respond very rapidly when soils are damp, right? And so, at least in this time of the year. And so that kept April soils cold. It kept the surface cold. And because of the frequency of the rainfall, I think that kept a lot of farmers out of the fields for much of the month. So not as much early planting as maybe last year that we saw during that month. That really continued through the first week of May. And then all of a sudden we had this, what we call an omega block, a blocking situation in May. Blocking means that we get basically high pressure anchored itself over the Eastern Corn Belt. And high pressure usually means a lot of sinking air in the atmosphere, and the air compresses and it can warm a lot. So that period of May 8th through about the 14th of May, we soared well into the 80s. A couple of places even tipped 90 degrees across the state. Big window of dry weather, for instance. So really followed some heavy weather second weekend of May, followed by very warm temperatures over the next 5 or 6 days. And it allowed the surface to dry out. And then obviously we finally saw a big bump up in planting. And even within a relatively short period, corn, emerging as well in some isolated parts across the state. So yeah, these transitions have been pretty interesting throughout this season. And again, that rapid switch to warm conditions, 8 to 15 degrees above average that week. And then back to somewhat more normal conditions that we had, for instance, last week. So yeah, that's kind of the season in a nutshell. I think overall, it'll be about average to maybe below average when we finally get through the month. In terms of our spring, and not as wet as we had predicted, not as wet as it looked like it was going to.
Yeah, when you say that April was on average dry, that isn't the way that I feel like I remember it. It seems like we were pretty damp through a lot of that month. But I think a lot of that, like you said, has to do with how cold and cloudy it stayed most of the month.
Yeah, that's true. And we in different areas of the state have obviously experienced slightly different conditions. So if you get up into north central, I'm thinking about Sandusky and over to Huron counties, that area has been pretty dry. Even since the first of the year, they're running deficits of about 3 to 4 inches below average. Of course, that comes on the heels of last fall, right, when it was so wet up there that a lot of planting was delayed, or a lot of harvesting was delayed until the ground froze up. On the flip side of that, you go to areas like Dayton, Ohio, northern Montgomery County, southern Miami County, that have seen 6 events already this year of at least 1 inch. So they've seen 18 to 20 inches of rain, and half of that has come in just a matter of a 5 or 6 day period. So again, climate summaries tend to hide some of those details. So some parts of the state have certainly been a lot more saturated. I would say areas from Cincinnati to Columbus and then eastward to, say, Jefferson County have been a bit wetter for this spring, balanced out again by much drier conditions a little bit farther north.
The cool conditions really frustrated me, especially in late April. It seemed like we just could not get our soil temperatures to come up there for a good week and a half or 2 weeks. They just hovered in that slightly below 50-degree range. And then all of a sudden it flipped to so hot in May. Is that a trend that we should expect to see? Because it feels like we don't get spring anymore.
Yeah, it's kind of hard. In terms of this, what we do see is extreme variability. So it fits the overall trends of this extreme variability and these rapid transitions between what we call hydrologic states from wet to dry is something that we've seen very strongly evident across the Midwest and across the Ohio, for instance, where we can rapidly transition between a wet to dry or a dry to wet. Usually it's a lot easier. It's a lot faster to go from a dry to a wet. It takes one big storm and you can do that. Usually it takes a little bit longer to go from a wet to a dry because it takes a little bit of time. But when you're basically looking at conditions in April where we had overnight lows in the upper teens, 2 days later we were in the mid to upper 80s. A couple days later after that, we were back in the mid 20s. Soils don't respond, that rapidly to those temperature changes, for instance, especially not in April, because the soil itself, it's not just a matter of what the air temperature is, but, we get a lot more solar radiation warmth from direct sunlight in the soil, say late May than we do late April, because the sun angle is so much higher and stronger. I mean, we're getting close to the solstice here, just 3 weeks from now, or 3 or 4 weeks from now. So, the stronger sun angle later in the season, we can get temperatures warming up really strongly into the 90s, hundreds, 2 inches below the surface. In April, the sun's not that strong yet, right? So even though the air temperature can bump up into the 80s, you don't get that big increase in your soils unless it's happening over several days, like we saw that second week of May.
Well, luckily, all of that is past us at this point, and we have in the last couple of weeks made some strong progress on planting, and hopefully we're going to wrap up soon. So can you give us some insights into what we can expect here in the near term?
Yeah, so really currently, overall, if we start with like soil moisture, we went from those early season surplus soil moisture conditions to really, a decent amount of saturation, not too wet, not too dry in our soils across much of the state. So, I think soils are in pretty good shape as we head through, the last week of May into June. Streams and rivers are running about average across the state as well. When we look at our forecast this week, it does look warmer than average to round out May into the first part of June here. So warmer than average at this point, highs in the upper 70s to mid 80s would be a little bit above average. That's really what we're expecting this week. We will be dodging some showers and storms over the course of this week. We're still in a fairly active pattern. As a matter of fact, we're still in a La Nina pattern. We can get to that here in a minute with the outlooks, but With La Nina pattern around, typically we do see more frequent rainfall. So if we can take advantage to finish out planting season here over the next few weeks, take advantage of those windows as we head into the first part of June, but then still get those, hopefully just a half inch, 3/4 of an inch rainfall scattered, over, once or twice a week. That would be probably ideal conditions, I think. And that's really the pattern that we see here to round out May and to start June.
Yeah, I know when we're trying to wrap up, those rains every 3 or 4 days can be frustrating, but especially with some of these heavier rainfall events we've had, softening up that soil surface on a regular basis and maintaining that good moisture in the seed zone is really important to make sure that we're getting this crop off to a good start. So I'm happy with the forecast right now. Let's keep it there, Aaron.
Try to keep it going. Yeah.
So looking into summer, what does that look like for us?
Yeah. So a lot of questions. I talked about La Nina continuing through summer. This is a bit unusual. This would be going into the third year in a row with La Nina conditions. And I always review this. So La Nina means that the sea surface temperatures in the tropical Pacific Ocean off the coast of South America are cooler than average. And what that means is that those sea surface temperatures basically impact atmospheric patterns across the globe. Here in North America, for instance, it typically makes the jet stream very wavy and you get a lot of activity, especially in the wintertime. In the summertime, it's a little bit different. The impacts during the summer La Ninas really focus dry and hot conditions across the central plains, Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, extending into the Missouri Valley and Iowa. And for us, we could be on the receiving end of thunderstorms that basically wrap around a high in the central portion of the United States, and we can get some frequent rainfall or thunderstorm activity. So this is really, again, La Nina doesn't have a huge impact in Ohio's weather. It's sort of no really strong signal on the precip, although it typically keeps our temperatures warmer than average. And right now, all of our outlooks they're leaning that way. June looks warmer than average, really in the overnight lows. So kind of step back a little bit. What we've seen in terms of our long-term impacts, and we've talked about a little bit of the changing climate impacts here before, but in the summertime, we're not really seeing strong upward trends in our daytime highs, right? So, we hit 92, we hit 94. We're not really seeing as many 100-degree days, for instance, that we saw back in the early 20th century. Most of our warming trends have been in overnight lows. So we often see a lot more 70-degree nights, even mid to upper 70-degree nights, because we have a lot more moisture, a lot higher humidity in the atmosphere, and that doesn't allow our temperatures to cool off as much at night. And so generally speaking, our summers have been warming, but mostly in the overnight lows. And that's really the outlook for this season too. We expect our temperatures to be above average throughout much of the summer, June, July, August, maybe even to September as well. And again, I think that's going to be a strong function of our overnight low temperatures being much warmer than average, while our daytime highs will be, warm, but not necessarily. We'll have some extreme hot. We know we will. We'll have to see how much that comes into play. But as long as we don't dry out too rapidly and we have moisture around, our summer will be warm and humid. If we start to dry out and we don't, those frequent rains don't come as often, the soil starts to dry out, that drought that's really entrenched across the western United States will start to edge this way. It'll start to make its way this way as well. As those temperatures, because typically we always talk about drought begets drought, right? As drought grows, it continues to expand because areas get drier and drier. And that can, in the summertime, when you don't have strong steering currents to move weather systems around, that can really lock in a pattern in place. So we'll be watching for that. Right now, we don't anticipate strong drought across the region, but it's always something we have to watch in July and August.
Yeah, that's the question that I've been getting. You see that drought monitor, you see those maps, and we've been hearing news out of, those western states about just how bad it is, especially the wheat crop. And I've been hearing farmers asking, is that going to spread to us? So that's a real concern.
Yeah, out west, you're right on. I mean, Thankfully, our wheat condition kind of improved as we went along through the spring season a little bit. The condition, in parts of Kansas, Colorado, it's been really bad, really thin wheat stands. They've been dealing with a tremendous amount of wind across that region, large number of dust storms, pastures being buried in dust. There's an effort to kind of maybe quantify how much soil has been lost from Colorado to the Central Plains, or even the Central Plains to the Northern Plains. On the flip side of that, spring has been probably one of the roughest springs again for parts of North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota that have really transitioned rapidly from drought conditions to deluge. And so, although it won't be a situation as bad as 2019 for a lot of the Midwest, there'll be a lot of prevent plant up in North Dakota, parts of Minnesota this year, just because it's been so saturated there. So we really have been in a Goldilocks situation here across the Eastern Corn Belt compared to places farther west.
Yeah, before we started recording, you mentioned it's kind of a slow weather time. There's not a lot to talk about, but that's really a relief when we're talking about farming. If there's not a lot to talk about with you, it means we've had it pretty good.
Yeah, there's never nothing to talk about, obviously, but overall our situation is much better than a lot of the Midwest.
So another thing that we worry about, especially as we move into later summer, are tropical systems moving disease and pests into Ohio. So what's the outlook for that kind of activity this year?
Yeah, so it really goes back to the La Nina conditions again. So La Nina, one thing it does in summer is it really induces a pattern over the tropics that can increase the number of named storms in the Atlantic Ocean. And that's primarily the tropical moisture that we get either directly from the Atlantic, the East Coast, but more often coming up through the Gulf of Mexico, and then coming up from the southeastern United States or southern United States into Ohio. La Nina increases usually the opportunity to see more named storms. Whether or not they land, that's always a big question, and it deals with that, more short-term weather. But I think the potential is there with increased numbers. Last year, of course, we talked a lot about the fall armyworm and the influx of that, which really was a result of slightly different atmospheric circulation. It was more a high pressure and movement around there that came up from the Missouri Valley. But that's always at play during the summertime. And so thinking about more tropical systems, and there's a lot more than fall armyworm that can come up from the south to disrupt operations here in Ohio. We'll have to keep an eye on it. It's certainly a possibility. Typically, we get our season started about now here the 1st of June, but it really gets rocking as we head into August and then even September. So definitely, again, heading into summer, it's something we have to keep an eye on.
And then a new issue that, we really never talked about until a few years ago, the wildfire smoke and the impact that has on our air quality and even our sunlight quality through the summer. I know we were talking earlier last week about how some New Mexico fires had already gotten some smoke this way. So what's that look like impacts this year?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you recall last summer, we had a lot of wildfire smoky days in the atmosphere last July, and that really cut down on solar radiation. And in some regards, more diffuse radiation may be better, may be worse, it depends on the situation. But there were a few days where the air quality was impacted. You could smell the smoke even at the ground level. And you mentioned the New Mexico wildfire already just a week or so ago. The plume of smoke, again, if you remember talking about the blocking high that we had, well, flow around that high actually took New Mexico smoke up in that derecho that caused that big haboob, the big desert, the big dust storm that moved across portions of South Dakota, Iowa, and Nebraska. But that smoke got pulled well up into southern portions of Canada and then came back down around the east. And actually, we had some smoke in our skies to cause some neat sunrises, but it was coming from the east. So the New Mexico smoke was going up, moving around the Great Lakes, and then coming from the east across Ohio. So that's pretty interesting. I mean, none of this stuff sits still, right? It's impacted by the weather patterns across the United States. But yeah, so with this once in, 1 in 1,200 year, at least the worst drought in the last 1,200 years, still going on across the West. And all of this intense dryness across Colorado and parts of Kansas and Nebraska, the wildfire danger and risk is really elevated for a large portion of the Central Plains this year. And so I would expect that as fires get ignited and they spread and probably large numbers of acres burned this year, we'll see plenty of wildfire smoke in our skies once again. Similar atmospheric setup. We'll see a lot of movement in from the west, and there'll be a lot of days that it's pretty smoky out there.
Hopefully we get still some good solar radiation to get some strong crop growth, because I don't like the idea of all those wildfires and all this smoke. Seeing the devastation with our neighbors to the west is always heartbreaking too, but even worse when it impacts us at the same time. So Aaron, as we wrap up, let's look way too far out into the future. What's our harvest outlook look like for this fall?
Yeah, this is a ridiculously early look, but certainly warmer than average conditions lingering. We'll see how much of that drought extends into the region. Now, overall, we've seen longer term drying trends in July and August across, say, west central, northwest Ohio. And then as we head into the fall, that's a season where we typically, or at least in trends, we've seen a switch toward much wetter conditions. Last year, for instance, the really wet conditions from July through November across Northwest. So right now, though, we don't see any strong indication of above or below on the precip side. A little bit more certainty in the warmth, and that really fits our extended growing seasons now and the opportunity, even with those, folks that have been a bit nervous about getting maybe a little bit later start this year compared to last year. I think there are plenty of days to reach those magic numbers and the black layer numbers before we see our first frost this fall. So again, that's a ridiculously early look, but right now I wouldn't foresee at this point any reason to believe an early frost or freeze. And we'll have to watch the precipitation and see how that affects our weather in our harvest.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure that if we do start seeing those drought conditions expand into Ohio, that you will be the first person we call to give us an update on the impacts of that. But as always, Aaron, very enlightening. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. Of course, you could always check out climate.osu.edu. We've got monthly and seasonal climate updates there. I'll be providing a summer outlook video on there as well, so look out for that. And as always, you know where to reach me, and look forward to talking to you soon. Hopefully you have a great growing season ahead.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.
Hey, podcast listeners. Just a reminder to give us a like or subscribe so you know when we release new episodes. If you're enjoying the podcast, be sure to leave us a review also. We appreciate the comments.